I come from a consulting firm that's sort of an economic development and real estate consulting firm. We tend to focus on the vibrancy and the future of cities and urban areas, and so we found, particularly in the last year and a half since Sandy, that thinking about that and focusing on urban resiliency and its complexity in the densely built environment that we have here in the Northeast takes you to a way of thinking about mitigation in a strategic way that is much different than the way that people have looked at disaster recovery and mitigation in the past. And although I call this presentation, urban resiliency, I think it relates to all different environments here in the Northeast. The point being, we're in a place that's much different than a lot of other places that have been impacted by storms and other disasters. We are densely built. Our infrastructure is old. There is a sunk capital investment that's significant. So mitigation is about thinking incrementally in many cases, rather than thinking about wholesale shiny new investment, particularly in the fiscal state that most of you, all of you, find yourselves in. The other thing I'd say, just by way of introduction, is I have had a chance to work on a number of different aspects of this, really what I wanted to talk about is sort of you've got the policy-making space that a lot of you are in, that is focused on really bringing resources to bear and modifying regulation. And what we found is you've got the technical engineering side of thinking about mitigation and disaster recovery, and it's very hard and very complex to bring the two together. So what we've been focused on is really bringing the two together. How do you deploy resources and regulation in favor of these very complex solutions in a complex, dense urban environment? So, just to sort of set the stage a little bit, and then I'll talk about some of the work that we've been doing. There's a kind of we find there's kind of a conventional approach to disaster recovery in the United States and elsewhere, which is you've got the immediate relief. You begin the rebuilding process, and you try to fund as much of that as you can. And then when you move into mitigation after your rebuilding focus is off the ground, conventionally we really look at home elevation and putting in place major pieces of infrastructure. And one of the things that's really become clear after Sandy is that it's very difficult to do that in a lot of the places that we live in. In New York City, where I've done most of my work over the last year and a half, we found that we now have, with the new best available FEMA maps, 68,000 buildings in the 100-year floodplain. We have 850 million square feet in the 100-year floodplain. And there's about 500,000 residents of the city who now live in the 100-year floodplain. And of course, as we know, one of the things that the city did as part of the special initiative for rebuilding and resiliency that I was part of is convene the New York City panel on climate change and got projections for the 2050s, now to the 2080s and the 2100s, and with the expected, let's say 30 inches of sea level rise by the 2050s, that number is going to grow very significantly to over $1 billion, $1 billion square feet of development in the 100-year floodplain. So, the solution of just elevating, you just need to look at these building types. The solution of elevating is just not in the cards for a lot of this product. And, the other thing is that in urban areas, even if you could elevate everything or just bring in major pieces of infrastructure, cities just aren't about that. One of the other things we focused on a lot is retail and services. And when you look at sort of the fabric of a community and the way that retail hits the ground and serves a community, makes it a vibrant place that has economic activity, you don't want it to look like this. And this is a great example that a lot of people use all the time. Hafen City in Hamburg, extraordinary piece of infrastructure and planning, essentially a floodable city. But you can see that blank wall, which is sort of when I look around some of the neighborhoods in New York City that we're working in, we don't want to see those blank walls get constructed. So we're trying to figure out how to make mitigation work in this dense urban context in a different way. I know I want to skip ahead a little bit, but so there are three things that we've been involved in, and really, I think it's a lot of us who are working on sort of post-Sandy recovery initiatives. You have to take a step back and say, well, what we're doing really is driven by the federal government and the significant appropriation that was made in January 2013, $50 billion for mitigation, including a significant amount of infrastructure recovery and repair, but also, very importantly, something that I know Josh spends a lot of time on, a community disaster block grant disaster recovery allocation through the Housing and Urban Development Department of $15 billion, for the federal government, a fairly flexible bucket of funding that is available and being deployed by states and cities across the Sandy impacted region. And so we're working on really three different initiatives. One that's done, that I took a leave from my consulting practice to be the deputy director of, which was the city's plan, the special initiative for rebuilding and resiliency, for how the city sought to deploy that recovery funding. And then more recently, and that was really and I'll talk about it, a technical, very intense, very specific, incorporating a lot of disciplines plan that sits there and really guides strategic thinking. But then what has also become clear since then, through two other initiatives that we're involved in, one, the New York Rising Community Recovery Planning process that Governor Cuomo initiated, which is, he's taken, rather than sort of the technical approach, the approach of distributing some of this allocated funding to individual communities and asking them to make a plan for how they think they should spend it on disaster recovery and mitigation. And then thirdly, something sort of, in some ways even more interesting, was Secretary Donovan's Rebuild by Design initiative, which says we've got the technical ideas, we've got the community-based planning, but we're going to try and bring in innovation in the design of solutions that come out of those other two places. And there'll be another session on this today. So they actually convened design experts from across the country and around the world in 10 teams to present solutions that are innovative. So we've been involved in all three of these, and I want to touch on some of the solutions and strategies that have come out of each of them to address this sort of thorny problem that we're all faced with, which is how do we mitigate in this complex built-out area that we have. First of all, the special initiative for rebuilding and resiliency, this was an effort that was convened by Mayor Bloomberg. He appointed a number of senior officials to work on this and asked them to create a plan that looked comprehensively at what happened during Sandy and why, at what will happen in the future, and what the city should do about it. And it was a very intense effort from January to June of last year. A lot of sleeping on sofas on the 5th floor of the building that we were working. There were about 40 senior professionals that were working as part of that initiative. And we really looked comprehensively in two ways. First, at all of the city's systems and infrastructure, to make specific recommendations about not just how to rebuild, but how to make these facilities more resilient, how to mitigate. And then we looked with a lens at the impacted communities across the city and said, how do we apply these citywide systems and infrastructure recommendations on the ground? So we issued a report. It was a very thick report, and it had over 250 initiatives in it. It also was really grounded in the climate science projections that came out of the NPCC, the panel on climate change that I mentioned, and in exploring cause in a lot of cases. So just one example that we always used is there was sort of a real initial concern about making sure that gas stations across New York City had generators because it was thought that that was one of the reasons that people ran out of gas. Well, the reality was it was a breakdown in the supply chain across the region where much of the fuel deposits was based in at-risk facilities on the New Jersey coastline. And so, there were generators could get to the gas stations, but there was no gas because the supply chain broke down. So, really sort of getting in a very intense way to some of this causality and coming up with solutions based on that has yielded a lot of very significant insights. And I don't have time to get into all of it, but just two examples to go through. First of all, comprehensive coastal protection strategy for New York City. What we did was we looked at the floodplain. We took a look at coastal risk, the probability of a storm surge having impact, And then we created a metric that we call floodable FAR, or really New York City's way of describing square feet of development, GFA, in other places. So we brought those two metrics together, which is how much risk is there and how much value and square footage, as well as concentrations of vulnerable populations, are there in order to create a prioritized plan. So where we started was, it's very hard to read this, but this is a $60 billion comprehensive plan to protect New York City. Now, clearly, we don't have $60 billion. The entire Sandy appropriation was $60 billion. But we used that set of metrics about the risk, the location of density, and the vulnerable populations to create a prioritized first phase plan that the city administration is now going about trying to fund and deploy, working with the Army Corps of Engineers, the state DEC, and a number of other agencies. So this was really laying the groundwork based on a series of analytics about what needed to be done. And just a couple of examples. The first strategy was increase the elevation of coastal edges. And we looked back and we found that for example, in Coney Island, beaches had been well nourished, where there was a dune system that was in place and hadn't eroded. Coney Island actually on the beachfront was really well protected. So we recommended the places where the Army Corps needed to prioritize getting sand back on the beach, and that's happening in the Rockaway Peninsula in New York City. So the edge elevation set of measures was fairly comprehensive. Then, the other one was looking at the sheltered inner areas of the city where it wasn't so much wave action on beaches, but storm surge over mostly built-up industrial era bulkheads that was responsible for disastrous flooding in a lot of communities, including in Lower Manhattan. And so there are a set of recommendations in the SUR plan to create protections for that, but also integrate it into the fabric of the urban environment. So here's an idea of a flood protection system on the east side of Manhattan where it's basically deployable, and there's a system set up where the panels can be deployed in advance of a storm to provide protection. This is being developed from a design perspective in a lot of different ways in New York City, and we would expect this to be deployed sometime in the near future. Another example that's more robust and also caught a lot of attention was the idea that on Manhattan's eastern edge, where there was a significant storm surge, you would look to create a multi-purpose levee that could finance itself. And this goes back to New York's sort of tradition of building Manhattan out as an island through landfill. On the west side of Manhattan, you have a community called Battery Park City that was built in a post-industrial era where the walls of the new land didn't need to be down at the level of shipping. So Battery Park City was elevated and was not impacted by Sandy. On the east side, we have conventional piers from the era of maritime shipping, and so the proposal was to build out a new landform on the east side, create significant real estate value, and use that to finance the flood protection. And that's another concept innovative in the urban space that's being advanced by the city currently in a feasibility study. The other set of recommendations in SUR that is significant is about building adaptation. And frankly, we found looking at what had happened that relatively new construction was relatively easy to protect. Many of the people in this room have worked on integrating flood protection requirements into code, and the federal government, the states, and the city integrated freeboard requirements for new construction so that we've got additional elevation. So new buildings, we've got a lot of success stories. The real issue in New York City was 75% of the buildings that were most severely impacted by Sandy were built before 1961, were combustible construction type, and were one story. So the real issue is about mitigation of that building type. And so the city is now pursuing efforts to encourage owners of buildings to partially mitigate those buildings, which are in place and are frankly not going anywhere. Elevate mechanicals, seal off doors, repoint bricks and facades in basements. So a lot of smaller scale mitigation efforts that can be implemented incrementally and incentivized incrementally. So that's really the public-private collaboration that will occur at the level of a building for mitigation. is implementing these partial improvements. And clearly, there's a lot of talk about flood insurance out there right now, which is good because there are some significant, very significant, potentially disastrous implications of recent policy changes. But if the federal flood insurance program can begin to recognize partial mitigation efforts like this in urban areas, we'll see significant relief. And you can see a way forward because you can see that, owners of buildings refinance their buildings, and if at that point, that capital moment they're required to make an investment, you can begin to see how they get to mitigation. The second initiative that came more recently out of the governor's office, as I mentioned, is called the New York Rising effort, and if you can imagine it, this is about how you bring some of these major technical recommendations down to the ground. So we've had the privilege of helping the state to run 7 of the 10 community planning processes in New York City. The state went and appointed planning committees that are representative of local residents. There's been a very significant public engagement requirement. I last counted, I think we're at about meeting 100 that we've held over the last 8 months across 7 communities, and I have a team that's very tired, that's been out in one community or another every night and on weekends for the last 8 months, just working through issues with communities. And there's a lot that we can say about it, but the major observation I'd make is that when you go and consult with people locally and integrate this community discussion, you go from thinking about major infrastructure and policy and regulation to things that really matter to people in an everyday way, like in one particular community, and they actually have a funding allocation. They're proposing to fund a workforce development initiative that will allow local residents to get involved in these mitigation efforts. One of the really big things that's come out of our effort is everyone recognizes that they need more relief centers, concentrated areas where after a storm, even if they evacuate, as they should do, when they come back, there's a place that they can go to resupply, seek the sustenance that they need or the protection that they need. So, I think in the 45 areas that the state is running the New York Rising program in, probably almost every one is proposing to harden a central place and supply it so that people can get relief. And that's something, it's much different than that technical work that we did. It's something that comes out of the scale of a community. We've also come down to things like creating emergency lighting in public housing, because in recognition, clearly we need to fix our utility systems and harden them, but when the utilities go out, we need that basic level of recovery and protection. And then other issues like stormwater management, drainage for sewer and groundwater problems are really come up in communities. And in this one particular community, they're proposing to fund for the first time in New York City, amazingly, a study that would actually identify the locations where the infrastructure fails, so that there's a document that the Environmental Protection Agency can use to go and make capital investments. So a lot of real sort of granular thinking coming at the local level that'll be of real value. And then the last initiative that we've been involved in is Rebuild by Design. I'm not sure Josh plans to talk about this a little more, but here we've been focused also about the neighborhood level and communities, and a recognition that in the 100-year floodplain in New York and New Jersey, there's 100 million square feet of retail and services concentrated in neighborhood corridors. It employs 20% of that area's residents, 175,000 jobs, and in different typologies and scales. It's neighborhood retail, it's industrial activity. We have large format destination retail, and we have the boardwalk destinations that are so important to the vitality of these communities. But those places are really exposed because fundamentally we want those places to be on the boardwalk at the edge of the beach where the water comes in, or we want them to be to have their inventory on the ground floor where people can walk by. And so we've been very focused on coming up with a toolkit of solutions for that neighborhood commercial scale about what they can do to make themselves more resilient in an affordable way. And just as an example, as we move toward the end of the work that we're doing, we've looked at strategies to adapt individual businesses and buildings and provide technical assistance. Straightforward things like helping someone be prepared to evacuate their inventory when they know a storm is coming, or making sure that their records are stored in the right location. These things are not very expensive to implement, but they can make a huge difference in terms of saving some of that business interruption cost that we see during a disaster. And then the more tangible mitigation actions, we're developing a lot of innovative solutions about how you go and protect a building. What do you do to protect a building so that it's more resilient? And then, of course, we're working on ways of looking at the financing of those improvements. One of the major innovations that I think needs to come is if we in fact are headed towards a place where flood insurance is significantly more expensive for businesses and residents, finding a way to finance reductions in flood insurance premiums so that investment in capital mitigation efforts is possible, I think is one of the major problems that no one is really focusing on. And it's got an analogy in the world of energy efficiency, where we have a much more advanced system, ESCOs and other approaches to finance energy efficiency cost reductions that really needs to be applied to this sphere, but it hasn't been yet. And so we're at this point raising this issue without a lot of solutions because this is a very complex regulatory environment. But that's a big sort of insight coming out. And then we're also focused on planning for the future of neighborhoods. In this case, how do we revitalize neighborhood corridors, create infill that's resilient, that in some ways is floodable, that helps to bring communities back more quickly and helps communities to afford the increased cost of living in coastal areas. And then lastly, I'll just end on this point. I mentioned some of these sort of protections against storm surge in the idea of a deployable system of flood walls. We're looking at a neighborhood in New York City and Brooklyn called Red Hook, where there's been a proposal for an integrated flood protection system that runs all the way around the neighborhood. And we're starting to figure out how the capital meets the ground in terms of community fabric. Little too much going on this picture, but the idea of sort of destination waterfronts where you have, this is actually the waterfront in Washington, D.C., where you have towers that you can insert deployable flood walls within. The idea of an elevated bikeway running through the neighborhood that incorporates this flood protection element. Even a great example in the Netherlands of a new project where a parking garage and new real estate development are getting integrated into a berm that has a dune in front of it, which is not just protecting that new development, but is protecting the whole community. And so again, leveraging the value of private real estate development to incorporate flood protection elements. So that's a major solution that we're working on. And then I would just end by saying, in this case, looking at the future of our commercial product in these neighborhoods and the commercial activity, it's where the policy meets the ground. So it's not just about figuring out how to spend the money and change regulation. It's how do we create financing vehicles for small businesses to adapt? What kind of capacity is there to give them technical assistance so they can implement a lot of these measures? And lastly, can we make infrastructure investments at this bigger scale, like an integrated flood protection system, rather than each individual property making the mitigation requirements? And so I think there's a lot of lessons learned there, but I think the idea about sort of bringing the technical interventions down to the scale of communities and fitting them in there in an incremental, implementable way is really what's come out of Sandy in the Northeast in a lot of ways. So thank you.